Organizations shape the world around us. It's time we shape them differently. Welcome to Orchestrate for Impact. Hello, welcome back. Today I'm joined by Josh Seiden. He's a designer, product leader, coach, and author whose work has shaped how teams around the world think about outcomes, learning, and the conditions for good work. You might know Josh from Outcomes Over Output, Lean UX, or his latest book, Who Does What by How Much? Practical Guide to Customer-Centric OKRs, Objectives and Key Results. And that's what we're here to talk about today. In this conversation, we unpack OKRs not just as a goal-setting framework, but as a way of working and a cultural intervention. We talk about aligned autonomy, the difference between output and outcome, and how OKRs can help organizations focus without defaulting to command and control, which we're so used to. Josh shares how OKRs can unlock distributed decision-making, support collaboration across functions, and help people closest to the work shape real impact, while also surfacing the invisible connections that so often go unacknowledged in complex systems. It's a thoughtful, grounded look at how the way we work shapes what we make, and why the structure of our goals might be the start of deeper change. Enjoy. Welcome to Orchestrate for Impact, Josh.
Oh, it's great to be here.
I'm so excited about this conversation with you, Josh, because, well, one, I've known you for a very long time, and you have been a very dear person in my life and career and in community as well. And seeing the work that you've been doing around OKRs and helping teams has been inspiring for me. And thinking about when we talk about orchestrating for impact, I thought we can't not have this conversation with you. So I'm curious about you, Josh, and how OKRs came to be a part of your passion and your focus.
Well, it's great to be here to talk about all that with you, Janna. The feeling is mutual. And so I've been working in technology for decades now. And from my entry level days in tech support through, my time in design and my time in working in product, like the through line has been trying to make technology work for people, right? And so everything that I've done has that orientation. Like, how do you understand what people are trying to do and what's going to create value for them, and how do we create, products and services and organizations that are able to do that and deliver that. And, in the early days, it was very focused on the kind of fine details, like the design of the product. And then sort of as my career has moved along, it's been about how do you bring that understanding of what people are trying to do into organizations? And how do you make it useful? How do you make that understanding useful so that organizations can act on that understanding and try to deliver value to people? And so it turns out that OKRs are a pretty good tool for doing that. They act as sort of a kind of the Trojan horse for human-centered thinking that lets you kind of set goals for the organization and for teams, and in ways that kind of express people-centered goals.
And maybe it would be useful to get your definition or how you describe OKR. So you've talked about goals and you've talked about teams. So can you give us a bit of an overview of that structure?
So OKR stands for objectives and key results. The OKR framework works in a couple of different ways, but primarily it's a goal setting framework. You name your objective, right? Here's the big goal that we're trying to achieve. So that goal might be, create the most delightful way to record a podcast online, right? And then your key results are your sort of measures. How do we know we've achieved the goal? what's interesting about OKRs is that they don't express a solution, right? So they don't say, well, we're going to build an app, right? Or we're going to build a set of features. Really, what they are is a question. Hey, we're trying to create the most delightful way to record a podcast. And we'll know we've succeeded when we've got thousands of creators working on in our ecosystem and whatever that is. And then that it acts like a question and with some guardrails. And then it asks people to bring their creativity to the table to solve the problem, to answer the question. And so OKRs work at the organizational level, right? You often see leadership setting OKRs at the highest level for the organization. OKRs can be then decomposed into smaller and smaller chunks that set goals for teams. And what's interesting about that is that it creates this sort of interesting structure that where you align the organization around these goals, but you're also not telling everybody what to do. So you're creating this kind of aligned autonomy, which I think, especially for today's kind of knowledge work focused organizations, is really critical and really hard to achieve.
I love that aligned autonomy. So that really gets away from micromanagement. So in terms of, even though, I guess in the way that you described in that instance, it may feel or seem hierarchical in how goals are set. And I think that's something interesting for us to sort of dig into around what does it mean for an organization as an entity to set goals, and how does it decide? But I think you're touching into something really interesting, which is around agency and some sense of localized emergence in a way in response to that question.
Yeah, absolutely. So the roots of OKRs, the roots of objectives and key results, go back to Peter Drucker, who created this system he called management by objective. So that's where that objective word comes from in this system. And he was really reacting to kind of the early sort of industrial management systems, right? Like the sort of Taylorism kind of stuff where we ran our factories based on time studies, right? Where leadership did the thinking and workers did the doing. And that's where all that micromanagement, the legacy of micromanagement comes from. And I mean, in kind of management thinking anyway. Mm. And so Drucker said, we need to unlock the knowledge and the creativity and the intellectual capability of our workforce. And management by objective does that. It says, here's what I'm trying to achieve. Here's what leadership is trying to achieve. Here's what we're trying to achieve as an organization. Now y'all go figure it out. He probably didn't say y'all, but and so then that sort of build on that was from Andy Grove at Intel, who added the key results piece of it, the measurement piece of it, to add that layer of sort of accountability and clarity that comes from the additional dimension that you get there. But it's definitely all about that. Like, let's enable the thinking that takes place at every level of the organization, because just by virtue of being in the C-suite, you have access to certain information, but you also are isolated from other critical pieces of information that you just don't have. And it's not because, you're a bad leader. It's just, it's not your job, right? Similarly, people, let's call them on the line, right? Individual contributors. They don't have that broad overview point of view, right? So they're not in a position to set strategy, for example, but they have the detailed understanding of the work, the context, and the sort of the critical material of the job, and that no one else in the organization has. And so that, you talked about this idea of like emergence in the organization. That's what you get when you enable, like, everybody to use their sensing sensing organs and their brains to try to, like, hey, solve the problem from my point of view.
I love that. And I think that's something with, I guess, this concept of orchestration that I'm pushing into around. Orchestration is not just an act of or a means of bringing things together. It's also a capacity to understand the materiality of what needs to come together in order, and then in which means I need to bring that together in order to get to the outcomes and potentially a through line into larger impacts. And so when you say the material of the job, I think that's, to me, is you're really starting to get into that concept of what is the materiality of organizations? Do we actually understand organizations as objects of design? And sometimes when I say the word object, it sounds so rigid, and it's not rigid because the materiality there's so much different layers of and different types of materiality within that. But what I hear you saying is when we let the people closest to the material that they are using day in and day out, that's really an unlocking piece for the entirety of the organization, because in most complex things like an organization there's no hero in an organization. No one person could possibly hold everything, do everything, know everything. So it sounds like that's the ultimate kind of acknowledgement of no one can know everything. And so we have to coalesce and be together in this in order for us to collectively know.
Right. It's this sort of interesting, it's a kind of, it's an interesting take on collaboration, right? When I had a very interesting experience in my career, I spent a bunch of years working on Wall Street. And one of the things that I discovered early on was that the part of my work as a designer was to sit down next to users and observe them doing their job and talk to them about their job. And when I started doing this, I was working in a company we were brokerage for institutional stock traders. So the people that we were working with were traders who were trading huge volumes of stock. And these people speak English, but they don't speak English that you understand or that I understand. They speak English that they understand. And so the professional jargon that of their world is opaque if you're not deeply immersed in it. And so my first couple of user visits and interviews, I really felt like I was missing half the story. I was sitting with these people and they were talking to me and they were open and engaged and willing to tell me the story. And I just couldn't understand 50% of what they were saying. And so I started bringing out with me on these visits, I started bringing out product managers in this organization. These were people who had been traders or been in adjacent positions and who had that knowledge and point of view. And they didn't know anything about design. They didn't understand why I was asking the questions I was asking. But the two of us were a really powerful interview team. And we could go back and forth and they would ask questions and I'd be like, oh man, that's a great question. But it never would have occurred to me to ask that question. And it would unlock stuff that was valuable for the two of us in a way that, so it's not just having access at some level of the organization. It's also bringing the right points of view together at each level in the organization. Do you know what I mean?
Because knowledge sits in lots of pockets and lots of places. And I would argue that a lot of knowledge is untapped because we don't create the space or the capacity for it to be put forward. So think of how many times we actually don't listen to people from where they are and what they're doing when they're saying there's smoke over here, and leadership of some kind going, I'm sure it's fine. It will be fine.
Don't worry about it. Just
look elsewhere. We don't, la, 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 we don't want to know that. And I guess one of the things that strikes for me is this other concept around orchestration as a leading capacity And I think leadership can come from anywhere. It's not hierarchical necessarily in its essence. But orchestration is leadership without all the power. So we think about leaders as having power, and traditionally they do have power in the sense of being able to do command and control. And I think this is a different way of thinking about, and I guess maybe some people use the concepts of soft power and things like that. How do you use constructs and alignment to create something that people want to or will participate in, or will give what they can in it? I guess are there I'm sure in your travels you see OKRs potentially being used in destructive ways rather than
Yeah,
constructive ways.
absolutely. 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 So we in the book we write about OKRs and we say that they are three things. So they are a goal setting framework, and that's what we've been talking about, right? That kind of structure of objective and key result. And they're a new way of working. That's the second thing, because they shift away from that command and control. I tell you what to do and you do it. And instead, they frame a problem. And so people have to go figure out the answer. And so that's new for a lot of organizations, that process of discovery, right? Well, we think we have an idea. Let's go see if it works. And let's go discover the solution. And so that new way of working, that's the second kind of way of thinking about OKRs. And the third way of thinking about OKRs is that they're an opportunity for a cultural change, right? And so if I'm a leader and I'm used to command and control, and I'm used to saying, well, you all go build this thing and tell me when it's done, right? And now I have to say, well, you all go solve this problem and tell me when it's solved. That's a really different conversation. And it sounds like a small change, but it's a giant change. And there's a huge amount of sort of discomfort that comes along with it. There's a huge amount of discomfort in letting go of that control for leadership. There's a huge amount of discomfort in getting the teams sort of getting orders like that and saying, what do we do now? And then the other piece of it is, if I'm working on a team that is discovering a solution, by definition, I'm probably going to discover bad solutions before I discover good ones. So does the organization tolerate that kind of learning journey? Does it tolerate iteration? Does it tolerate experimentation? Does it tolerate failure? You were saying a moment ago that OKRs have the potential to change the way organizations think about power, maybe. I'm paraphrasing. Mm-hmm. But OKRs also, they don't work unless organizations are willing to do that. And so if organizations are going to hold on to the old power dynamics and just say, like, look, I say jump, you say how high. Look, don't bother. Don't bother, because OKRs without autonomy they're kind of theater.
Mm. And so I hear in that, I guess, without the organization actually setting those conditions of, we are a learning organization, we are an adjusting organization, we accept that we do not go from problem to solution because we live in complexity. And I think what I hear in that is this tension between when organizations really face into the complexity that they literally sit in every day. It's not like it's suddenly, oh, this is difficult or this is unknown. There's things like that all the time. It feels like the more complex and unknown and messy something is, the more people within organizations are attracted to certainty.
Yeah.
And versus confidence building. And so what I hear in what you're saying is because we're asking questions and not dictating the answers, you inherently are saying, build up our confidence around this thing rather than maybe building certainty into it. I'm curious about that tension of
Yeah.
there's like a letting go. Like I feel like if you could like demonstrate in your body how a really rigid, hierarchical, command and control, micromanagement, like they want things to just happen. And look, in some industries,
Right.
you have to be repeatable, and it's too risky to not be on the mark. But some
Well,
spaces,
yeah,
yeah.
right. I mean, like, yeah, and look, there's some work where we know the answer, right?
It's well
And
understood.
so the question is, yeah, it's a well understood problem. And so the uncertainty is how do we execute well, right? And so, like I think all work has different kinds of uncertainty around it. But but we're sort of we're often unwilling to admit that or deal with that. And I think that's kind of the dynamic that you were describing. But and so OKRs work really, really well in a context where there's a great deal of uncertainty, right? I mean, that's really what they're good for. And so because they say like, let's go figure out the right way to do this. Let's go figure out the right way to solve this problem. And so first you have to have an organizational willingness to say, actually, this problem is a problem we don't know how to solve. And that doesn't mean we don't know how to solve where you can have a business where, we're really good at this and we're really good at this and we're really good at this. But every business has some pieces, or every organization has some things where you're like, we don't know how to do this, or we don't know the best way to do this. And so that's a good place to start thinking about OKRs as a tool. And then the other thing is, because they're sort of experimental in nature, it's useful to start, and you see this in everybody who talks about OKRs says, start small.
Mm.
Start with a team that tolerates uncertainty. Start with a problem. Maybe don't start with your number one problem, right? If you're going to adopt OKRs, like, start someplace where it's like, all right, what happens if we get a B- in this? What happens if our first stab at OKRs is C+, right? Is that going to kill the company? Don't do it. Right?
You heard
you
it
know,
here, folks.
yeah, like start someplace where it's like, I've been very inspired by, years ago, it's like a 15-year-old book by now, but Eric Ries's book, The Lean Startup. And Eric Ries really, his kind of major orientation is you want to adopt a kind of an experimental point of view when you're facing uncertainty, right? And the defining characteristic of an experiment is it's safe to fail, right? And so, we're not going to say, well, I'm going to take all the money in my retirement savings and I'm going to bet that I'm the fastest runner in the park today. Like, that's a bad experiment. It's not an experiment, it's a bet. And I think if we're embracing OKRs as an experimental approach, right, we want to find places where we feel like it's safe and responsible to experiment.
When organizations are setting these goals and then translating the goals into questions, I'm curious about how that translates then into who's being asked to play into that question.
Yeah.
I could imagine that sometimes that gets maybe mistakenly put at a function level where it's like, IT, here's your question, and legal, here's your question, when really some of these questions are cross-spanning and necessarily demand the skills of multiple people, multiple functions to come together. So I'm curious about how even the act of having to answer a question is creating those cross-functional
Yeah.
moments or demands.
I think that the first thing to understand is that, like, OKRs, the best way to think about OKRs is that we use them to focus the organization on the most important thing. So we don't use them to describe every goal in the organization, right? So there's some goals. Christina Woodkey's book talks about this idea of heartbeat measures, right? Things we have to do to keep the lights on, okay? So those are the kind of things that you assign to a department, right? Okay, for the marketing department, these are your heartbeat measures. Legal, these are your heartbeat measures, whatever, right? But we're going to have a focus initiative, right? And so, for example, I worked with a startup 10 years ago. They were a tool for enterprises. They sold to enterprise clients, and they made it was a very competitive space at the time. And they decided that their most critical success factor was they were currently like, they'd get clients' interest, and clients would say, yeah, we're really interested. Let's try a pilot. And if the pilot is good, we'll sign the contract. So then they would go into a pilot cycle with these clients, and they'd be 12-month-long pilots. So they're investing a huge amount of money in a huge amount of effort and time in unpaid work. And so they decided that their strategic target was going to be, and I remember the CEO saying this, that the target was faster time to value, right? That was going to be the strategic push for the next 6 months in the company. And so then the question to the whole organization, this was at the time, it was an organization of about 300 people. And so the question was, how are we going to achieve faster time to value? Legal, what can you do? Marketing, what can you do? Technology, what can you do? Sales enablement, what can you do? Sales engineering, what can you do? Right? All the different groups. So you can ask that question at the functional organization level. And it might be that as a sales organization, we look at that question and we say, well, you know what? Some organizations are just never they're going to be really hard for us to win a quick pilot with this kind of organization or this kind of organization. But if you want us, we can focus on this sector, because this is going to be a ripe target for finding prospects who will be a good fit for fast pilots. So in that case, sales actually, they had a strategic target, which was now looking at that high level OKR, they were able to write an OKR that expressed that sales strategic goal, right? And was like, okay, well, in that case, like, here's what we can do. We can get to work on supporting that kind of messaging. And then the product organization has to look at this, and this is where you'll start to see some more like cross-functional goals emerging. It is like, well, okay, what do we do with our product development plans and roadmap? We've got all these features planned for the next 4 quarters. Are these the right features to be giving us faster time to value? Or maybe we have to scrap this roadmap and rethink the roadmap, right? So that we can deliver a product where we can deliver fast time to value. And how would we express that in our OKRs as a product group, right? And so it starts, the sort of fundamental question is, given this goal, what can we do as a work group, whether that's a department or a team, within our scope of control? What can we do to help the organization hit this goal? And then there's this kind of third piece, which is like leadership has to look around and say, in order to succeed, work that nobody's doing and nobody's responsible for. So we might have to create capacity in the organization to do this new thing that currently nobody's doing. And that might be it might just be a new team, or it could be like a new business unit, right? And then that unit gets sort of held accountable to this focus OKR.
And with, I guess, that scaffolding of the actions that help you respond to the question, I guess then with all of those mechanisms of the coming back together and checking in and looking at those measures, that's really calibration moments, I guess, for the organization to go, you've interpreted the question in a different way than we intended, or that's where you can that's where the adaption or the adaptability, I would imagine, comes in terms of questions shouldn't be so rigid that they are unchangeable.
Right. Yeah. You'll hear people talk about this thing called the OKR cycle. And so that's that. Remember, I said OKRs are three things, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're a framework, a new way of working, and a cultural intervention. And so this new way of working is sort of governed by this OKR cycle, where, typically annually you set your big OKRs. And then quarterly you check in on them. You actually check in on them every week, every month, every quarter, every year.
Mm.
And so the rhythm that people seem to find that works is that you need to kind of hold your goals steady for a quarter as you work on them. But you need to have the flexibility to adjust them if you discover that you've set your targets incorrectly. And so you kind of check in on them every week and every month, but every quarter you take a step back and you say, are these the right goals? Do we need to ratify them? Do we need to revise them? Do we need to, double down on them? What's the data that we've collected in the past quarter that is going to help us make these decisions? Because all of the work is about gathering data, right? Is this working? How do we know it's working? Are we seeing the outcomes, right? Because the key result is the place that holds the outcome, right? And so are we seeing the specific outcomes that we are trying to generate? And if we're not seeing them, why?
And one of the things I wonder about, and I guess just from a language point of view, I think about outcomes, organizational outcomes can contribute to and can ladder up, though not all ladder up to, broader sort of societal impact. I guess if we really hold at the core the role that organizations play in our society, and singularly they contribute, and then collectively organizations contribute to the world that we live in. I wonder about the through line, or how OKRs could be used, or even if they should be used, to show that through line all the way up to, I guess, those types of outcomes, or those types of impacts. And I'm curious about kind of the tensions for organizations to go, I don't have a capacity as an individual, as a team, to always be thinking so deeply with every moment, every action that I'm taking on, is this good or bad? Is this right or wrong? Is this laddering up to, because it's a lot of cognitive load to be going at that smaller level. So I'm curious about maybe how OKRs, I guess maybe that's in the goal setting somewhere, has to be a mind towards, if one of our goals is around something for the, I guess, something maybe for your product organization, but making sure that whatever new product we're making or whatever we're exploring, that we have our values or our commitments towards being regenerative, being circular, potentially in how we set up that product life cycle. I'm curious about where does that sort of connection making happen? Because I think it's too much for an individual at every moment and every time to be holding all of these things.
Yeah. So I use a framework that I first came across from friends and colleagues in the nonprofit world. And this framework was developed by the Kellogg Foundation. It's called the logic model. And I'm going to really oversimplify it. So for folks who are familiar with it, forgive my oversimplification. But there's kind of three levels that we think about in kind of day-to-day terms. There's impact, which is the kind of big long-term value that we're trying to create, right? So we might be thinking about climate change and reducing energy usage, right? Something that's obviously good, obviously important, right? And the result of many factors, right? So I can't go to a small team at a company and go, climate change, that's you, Janna, right? You're our climate change person. The rest of us will keep doing whatever we do. Right? So you've got impact, right? And in business, large organizations, there's just things like revenue and profit and market share and those kinds of things. And then the next level down is outcome, right? And that's it from the framework. The framework defines it as outcome. And so the framework has a pretty broad definition of outcome. It's a change in knowledge, a change in attitude, or a change in behavior. In my work with organizations, I completely lean into behavior change because it's really concrete, it's really measurable, and it's not that it's the only kind of outcome in the world that's important. It's that it's the most concrete. And for organizations that are trying to build this capability, a change in behavior that creates value for the organization, for the person doing the behavior, that's an outcome. And in fact, the shorthand that I use in my work for that, it's a valuable change in human behavior that creates results for the organization. In other words, who does what by how much? It's a measurable change. Who does what by how much? And so that's why we call the book Who Does What by How Much. And so that's the outcome that we're seeking. And it turns out that, and then the third level down is output. So the stuff we make, right? So we make a product, people do a thing with it. The sum of all those things is impact, right? And so it turns out that when you start to look at that sort of middle layer, that outcome layer, that there's never one outcome. What there is a story of behavior. People do this and then this and then this and then this and then this. And if you spent any time in the world of design, right, this is a user journey or a customer journey, right, where there's a series of behaviors. And some of them are kind of incidental connecting tissue. And some of them are really critical behaviors, right? And what you can do is you can kind of align your work to that story and to those behavior changes. And you can break them down quite small. So I was recently talking to someone who worked in an organization. I'm not actually sure that I can say their name, but they make a product for utilities that helps utilities understand what the utilities end customers are doing. And utilities, at least here in the US, have a mandate to reduce energy consumption and a specific mandate to reduce energy consumption during peak hours, right? So you can hear that story, right? There's an impact there, reducing energy consumption, right? Or reducing the harmful effects of climate change at the impact level. The behavior that we're targeting is end consumers reduce energy consumption during peak hours by X%. That's a regulatory mandate they face. So what do you make to get people to do that? Well, they experimented with a bunch of things, and it turns out that you can prompt people with certain kinds of information, right, that really works, that really gets them to not run their dryer from 4 PM till 9 PM, right? And you can say, well, as an organization, our goal is to get people to reduce peak energy consumption. But what are the behaviors that lead up to that? Well, they've got to open the email. So maybe there's a copy team that's just working on writing good headlines to get people to open the email. Your job is open rate. That's the outcome for your team. And your team is the call to action team, right? You want people to click that button so they go learn more, or they subscribe to the program, or whatever they do. And your job, marketing team, is to get people to trust the utility company, because nobody trusts the emails they get from the utility company. The utility company wants me to use less energy. No, they make money when I use more energy. Why would I trust the utility company? So you've got like this sort of, when you start to look at the story that way, there's all of these small behaviors that you can distribute through your organization that can get everyone aligned around this big story, which is getting people to use less energy during peak hours, right? And so that's kind of the way that laddering works, right? From the sort of most detailed level, like someone's writing a headline, to all the way up to climate change.
I love that because in a previous conversation with Tim Thompson, talking about systemic design and talking about portfolios and interventions. And I think there's this interesting way of thinking about that with what you've just been describing in terms of that's a portfolio of activities and behaviors and levers that maybe one lever alone won't do it. And so this is where that orchestration part of going, in order to get to that ultimate impact, but even to even get to some of these types of outcomes that we know we need to see, these are the parts and pieces. And I think what's interesting around this concept of orchestration is, can that be emergent? When can that be emergent from the groups that are part of that ecosystem, kind of knowing the part that they play? And when do you need some type of orchestration to be going, you are the email part, so you're this part, and do you even understand the role that plays in this bigger thing? And so I think what's interesting is sometimes people don't even understand the part of the puzzle that they are working on, what role that is. Like they may know it in its isolation, but they may not know the combination and the power of it, and I guess that alchemy of when it comes together. I think that's where I think it's really interesting around how are we telling that picture that you just painted. I think that there's somebody, or somehow we know that all those pieces fit together. And I think that the OKRs and those outcomes that we're trying to get towards our larger goals just sounds like it's a way to surface maybe some of the unseeable connections that maybe we're not seeing for ourselves.
Yeah, it's definitely like a way of telling that story about how the work of my part of the organization fits into the big picture. And the challenge, right, is it's not always clear how those pieces fit together. Like sometimes all we have is a hunch, right? And that can be true from the people who are doing the work, but it can also be true at the leadership level. Like I'm going to say as a leader, like, you team, you need to do X because I think this is missing. Well, now we all have to be willing to kind of lean into that as a hypothesis as opposed to a hard and fast order, right? Is it working? What if it's not? Maybe I have to tell the boss that it's not working. But it is a way of having a conversation about those things and those connections, right? And trying to, I like the idea of thinking about this as a portfolio. It's tempting to think about it as a really neat hierarchy. You know, we know that complex problems, they're never neat hierarchies. They're always messy webs. And so this idea of a portfolio is, it's a nice way to think about it.
Because some of those things might be singular intervention. Some of them might be very coupled and dependent interventions. Right. And it almost goes, even if you're tackling the problem or the question from where you sit within the organization, it creates a necessity to see how it all comes together. Because it may be that from a measurement point of view, I am getting people to open the email. And so maybe from my measurement for the part that I'm working on, I go, yay. But if it's not somehow then connecting into the other parts, it doesn't matter that the email is opened.
Yeah. I worked with an organization. I mean, there's a lot of pieces here. I worked with an organization that operated essentially like a 3-sided marketplace, right? So think about like a delivery app, right? So I'm a consumer. I press a button. I want to order dinner from this restaurant. That's side 2. Side 3 is the courier, the independent gig worker who's going to drive to the restaurant, pick it up, right? And this is this was a really cool company. They were a relatively new company. They were built understanding that data was their lifeblood. And so they had incredible data on everything. And what they understood was the relationship between the time that I press the order button to the time that the order is dispatched to the restaurant, to the time that the restaurant calls the courier, to the time that the delivery is made. You would think that faster is better for everybody, but it's actually not. Like, it's possible for that relationship to be too fast, right? And then all kinds of bad things happen in the network where you get the network out of balance. And so because they had incredible data and they had great data scientists, they were able to sort of understand that their major problem was keeping the network tuned rather than always speeding up the network. And so, and I think that's just kind of an example of the problem that you're talking about, right? It's like, if I'm on the order dispatch team, like, I'm going to bring that number down. We're going to perform the heck out of this. You know what I mean? But actually what you're managing are these relationships.
And I think being able to see the gestalt of it, right?
Yeah,
How
right.
it all, the whole system. I just think it's interesting for us and for those of you who are orchestrators and thinking about this and hearing about this, and thinking about what are the ways and means that can support, I guess, that orchestration. I think using those OKRs as a way to scaffold and create focus, as you said, it's not for everything. It's not meant to be how we run the organization, full stop. It's around when we need to do something new or different or shift or adjust, or it's in these liminal moments of, this is not the everyday, but this is what we have to focus on. It just sounds like
Our focus.
It's a really interesting, it's not just a tool set, it's a mindset. I'm hearing it's a sensibility, it's cultural way of being. I just think it's really powerful. And I think the beauty of what I see you and Jeff doing with this work is, I think I can imagine people come into it going, I want a way to get to an outcome, and almost maybe hope it's like the secret sauce, the panacea that will get us there. And what they come to find out is actually it's you having to change how you are in order to actually get to that.
Yeah, it's a vehicle that can enable change, but I think change is hard, full stop.
And creating that space within those teams by putting it as a question, I think really allows you to get to the fact that you have to design the change. And in designing the change, you have to experiment with that change, and you have to get into the materiality of what it actually takes to get there. So, oh my goodness, Josh, I feel like it just scratches the surface. I mean, it only scratches the surface, but I guess, do you have any last thoughts on what you think sort of orchestrators in organizations, if they're not using OKRs already, kind of what's the starting point for them to even explore if it's the right thing for them?
I think OKRs can be used for a lot of different goals or a lot of different change purposes, right, in the organization. They can help us create alignment and autonomy. They can help us create focus. They can help us create transparency. They can help us create accountability. And I think when you actually start to talk to organizations that have implemented OKRs with some success, what you'll see is that they've adapted them to their context and to their purposes as they've adopted them in their organization. And I think it starts, so that the journey starts with understanding what your purpose is. What's the thing you're trying to get better at as an organization? And then hold yourself accountable to that in the use of the tool. Don't be satisfied with saying, well, we've rolled out OKRs to 100 teams. Like, who cares, right? I used the hammer 100 times when I fixed my back deck. Who cares? And so hold yourself accountable to making that improvement, and then use that to understand how to start implementing OKRs.
And start small.
Start small. Yeah. Start small and start safe, and expect it's going to take a while. Everybody wants to see results in the first quarter. And I think good implementations, you'll start to see results in a year. And I was just talking with an organization that's having great success with OKRs after 5 years, and they've got probably a quarter of their organization on them. It's a journey.
And an important one. Well, thank you, Josh. I so appreciate your brain and your spirit and your advocacy of this. So thanks for your time.
Thanks so much for having me on the podcast to talk about this stuff, and for the thoughtful questions. It's really, really fun.
Thanks, Josh.